Okay, primary sources. How to read primary sources well. First, I want to dispel a myth, or I want to dispel a fear that primary sources are harder to read than secondary sources, and the sometimes assumptions that we make that I'm going to have a hard time reading the primary sources. First, they're not necessarily harder. Sometimes secondary sources are harder for different reasons. Okay, but uh, primary sources can be harder insofar as they're from a different time and place, and they might use weird language and that kind of thing. And sometimes they're harder to read because, frankly, they sort of grate against our sensibilities as 21st century moderns. And so that's fair, right? But in terms of whether or not you and I can read them, I think it's a fallacy to say that they're too hard for us and we ought not try. Um, there's going to be things that you find in old readings, old primary source readings, that are going to be very similar to our experience. Human beings falling in love, like Abelard and Heloise, but then there are going to be things that are just really strange, okay? And there might be weird vocabulary and all that. That's all true. But with a little effort and little time, and just sort of allowing yourself to ease into a particular text, because like any text, whether it's secondary or primary, there's going to be an author's voice, and there's going to be an author's world, a world that we may not know, and a voice that we're not used to hearing to or listening to, just like a person. It's like, just like a living person, right? That you're just getting to know. It takes time to cultivate a friendship where you feel at ease and comfortable, and where you can begin to hear their voice and intuit what they have to say. So treat these texts like you might treat persons, right? Give them some time, give them some space to be themselves in your presence. Okay. So, take, for example, Bonaventure, one of our first readings. This is a weird text, right? There's going to be some things you find and you're like, wow, like I have no idea what he's talking about, right? And there might be some things you might think, wow, actually, I kind of get it, right? Maybe I resonate with some dimensions of this. And maybe there's something in between, or maybe there's a sense in which you may not fully get it, but maybe it's doing something to you. It's spurning you on to think creatively in new ways about your own present situation. All these things happen when we read primary texts. I think of them as sort of like time capsules, right? It's like, I don't know if you ever see the old film Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures, but I don't know, just think of it as like you're traveling in time, like you're traveling back in time and you're meeting people from a very different time and place with a lot of different assumptions, maybe even different beliefs or sensibilities. And these texts open up a window into a different world for us. And I think that's one of the great values of primary sources. So read them in that manner, right? Recognize the places in yourself and myself where we're tempted to kind of, you know, I don't know, judge them or bring to bear our sensibilities upon them, right? Which is not to say we shouldn't, consider those things. But for a moment, if you will, put them up on the shelf, right? Put those assumptions up on the shelf and try to have the sort of historical humility, or whatever you want to call it, to come to those texts on their terms, to allow them to speak to us, to allow them to, in a sense, come as a representative of a different world. And I think you'll find it valuable. I also think primary sources um, are some of the best ways for us to remember history, frankly, because they're artifacts of a different time, and they strike us so. Uh, they're not just merely descriptive of a time, right? Like a secondary source is descriptive of the time that we're considering, and they may draw from those primary texts. But the primary text is like meeting a person. It's much more memorable. And it's like meeting a foreigner or something, right? We're like, whoa, like that was different. It's like when you travel to a different country and you're like, you remember the places, you remember the cuisine, you remember the smells and all that. A primary text is like getting closer to that kind of an experience, right? And so I think because of that, it assaults our senses. It assaults our sensibilities in ways that make it more memorable. And so I hope you have fun with them. I hope you enjoy reading them. And I hope you yeah, dig in. So, bon appetit, as they say.